everyone. My name is Sara Shikhman, and I'm the managing partner and founder of Lengea Law. And this is our webinar about PDGF. And joining me on this webinar is my partner, Shirin Adelman, and she's going to talk about PDGF, its legal status, and all the questions that we've been getting about PDGF and how to approach this new injectable and what are the legal ramifications of doing so and everything related to that. So without further ado, I'll let Shirin introduce herself. She has tons of experience in this space and has been the primary point of contact for so many clients and their questions about this. So Shirin, why don't you go ahead?
Thanks, Sarah. I'm excited to be here. It's a pleasure to be here, and I've been a partner at Lengea. I've been working with Sarah as our managing partner for about the past 5 years. I've been working in the corporate and healthcare space for about 20 years, and at Lengea, we've advised nearly 2,000 clients in the medical wellness, aesthetic, regenerative, even other areas of healthcare. So, really excited to talk about PDGF today.
Awesome. And of course, we have to give the boring attorney disclaimer that this presentation is for educational purposes only. And if you want specific legal advice for your situation, please contact your legal team. That may be us, but that may not be us. So just keep in mind that this presentation is just educational. So on this presentation, what we're going to talk about is briefly, what is PDGF? Since neither Shirin nor I are medical professionals, we're not really going to go deep into that. We'll just cover that on the surface. But mostly what we're going to talk about is the FDA status of PDGF, what's the legal framework, what's the standard of care, and how to mitigate risks with respect to this treatment and other non-FDA approved treatments. So first thing is, what is PDGF? I can cover that one since a lot of people seem to ask me the medical question, even though I'm not a doctor. And I always tell people, like, I don't really know. You should really talk to whoever is your chief medical officer. So PDGF, in summary, is a growth factor. It's involved in cell division and tissue regeneration. It is found naturally in some forms, and it's also PDGF-BB specifically is in 4 FDA-approved products. But importantly, none of those products are FDA approved for aesthetic injection or microneedling with those products. So, Sharon, anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So PDGF-BB is considered unapproved, but it's not off-label. We haven't seen any current FDA warnings with respect to PDGF, but using it requires really careful risk management. And we're going to kind of get into that in the presentation as well. Training, consents, insurance, etc.
Okay, perfect. So let's talk about, like, what is the current FDA status of PDGF?
So it's considered not approved for aesthetic injection or microneedling. And that's different than off-label. Off-label is when something is not used as intended by the manufacturer. At this stage, it's considered unapproved, but doesn't make it illegal to inject. That essentially transfers a lot of the responsibility to the provider to make sure that they're offering the best standard of care.
Perfect. And has PDGF received any FDA warning letters?
PDGF has actually not received any FDA warning letters, and other products such as exosomes, in some cases stem cells, salmon sperm, they have received FDA warning letters, but interestingly enough, PDGF is getting a tremendous amount of press on social media. There's a big perception about it being a certain way, but there are other procedures that have already received FDA warning letters.
Got it. And so if a provider chooses to use PDGF, and let's say the injection method, if they try to do, for example, PDGF for under eyes, what do you recommend they do? Like, how do they protect themselves?
So the key with using these innovative treatments under eye, again, because it's currently unapproved, is you want to disclosure is key. You definitely want to disclose PDGF's unapproved status clearly to patients, which is number one. You don't want any confusion as to its status on your website, in your marketing, how you talk to the patient. You also want to obtain a comprehensive informed consent covering its experimental nature and risk. We've been developing a really robust consent in real time that essentially covers these areas. You want to document. You want to document your training expertise, treatment rationale and protocols, patient assessment and outcomes. It's a really good idea to have the right malpractice insurance coverage in writing for PDGF injections and microneedling. You want to avoid marketing claims that imply that FDA approval or guaranteed efficacy. And then afterwards, you want to, after the treatment is performed, you want to monitor patient safety closely and manage adverse events promptly.
Okay, perfect. And one of the things that about the legal framework for this is it's considered a complementary and alternative treatment. So what does that mean? And what's the framework for using those kind of treatments?
So the guidelines for alternative treatments from the Federation of State Medical Boards is that it has to be scientifically justified and reasonably safe. The patients are provided informed consent, acknowledging experimental use. There is detailed documentation of treatment and outcomes, and the provider has appropriate training and expertise.
And what is this federation of like state medical boards? Is that something that's like brand new, or is that something that's been around for a long time?
Oh yeah, it's definitely been around for a long time. It sets the standards for nationwide medical boards and standards of care and appropriate standards of practice. It's kind of like the industry standard for good practice.
Got it. And let's talk a little bit about what standard of care is and how that relates to malpractice. Because a lot of claims online or people talk about, well, doing certain things is malpractice or doing certain things breaches standard of care. What is that, and like, how does that work?
So standard of care in a nutshell is what a reasonably competent provider would do in a similar circumstance. For example, if someone is unfortunately a subject of a malpractice claim, what people look for are, was there a duty to the patient? Was there a breach of standard of care? Was there a causation of harm? And were any damages incurred by the patient? So more specifically, with respect to PDGF or anything that's unapproved by the FDA, you may breach the standard of care if there's no credible safety data or scientific basis, you're misleading patients about approval status, you have inadequate consents or poor documentation, and you're failing to manage complications properly.
Got it. So it is possible to breach standard of care with lots of different procedures, including PDGF, right? If these conditions are satisfied. So it's not like doing PDGF automatically satisfies standard of care, just like doing anything wouldn't automatically satisfy standard of care, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's why it's so important to be trained properly, to have the appropriate documentation. If there's actually more responsibility when you're working with unapproved procedures and medications, just because it's new, novel, you're taking more risk on yourself as a provider. There's a lot of opportunity there, but there's also more responsibility. That's really important to keep in mind.
And what are some risk mitigation strategies for when providers choose to use these kind of treatments?
You definitely want to disclose PDGF's unapproved status clearly to patients. You know, we've had some clients come to us and on their website, they mentioned some procedures that are FDA approved, and they had a general take to that, and patients were very frustrated because they felt that they were misled. So be super, super clear about the fact that this is unapproved. You want to have comprehensive informed consent covering the experimental nature and risks. And we've been developing really robust consents with respect to this that we offer to our clients. You want to document your training, expertise, take advantage of training programs, gain competency in the area before performing this procedure. You want to document your treatment rationale and protocols. You also want to document patient assessments and outcomes. Another really important aspect of risk mitigation is getting the right malpractice insurance.
Yeah, we have a couple of brokers who we know who are really good in the med spa space that we could put you in touch with. And there are several companies that are covering PDGF. So it's just important to get that coverage in writing. Sometimes people
Yeah.
say, well, I called the insurance and they told me something, but unless you have that conversation fully documented, we just advise having that those types of conversations in email.
Yeah, absolutely. Writing is so important because if you're just talking about it, it's, you know, he said, she said, she said, she said. You definitely want to have as much as you can in writing. And after the treatment, it's great to be monitoring the patient's safety closely and you want to manage adverse events promptly.
Yeah, and this is true for everything, right? If a client gets hyaluronic acid filler and has a something like a vascular occlusion, you want to make sure you attend to that stuff right away, and you have Hylenex and other procedures on in your inventory so that you're really prepared for adverse events as well. A lot of times, the adverse event management and the client management during adverse events is what really gets providers in trouble, not even the product itself.
Absolutely. And it's also interesting. There's so many products that we take for granted today that were either unapproved or off label, like Sculptra mixed with other drugs or dilutants, Hylenex, NAD, compounding GLP-1s, hormone replacement therapy, PRP, PRF, exosomes. There are a whole bunch of procedures and medications that we take for granted. And they were in a similar situation. They were new, novel at one point, and people just, use them. And there were some great outcomes, some not so great outcomes. And over time, it becomes mainstream.
Yeah, and let's talk about advertising and what we recommend in terms of should people advertise unapproved uses online and how the FDA regulates people advertising things online.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So the FDA and the FTC regulate the promotion of medical products, including providers advertising. So those are the two governmental agencies that cover that scope. Advertising unapproved uses with efficacy claims can lead to legal and regulatory penalties. So you don't want to overpromise. You definitely want to avoid misleading or unsubstantiated claims. You definitely want to avoid advertising products as FDA approved when they are not. And state medical boards may investigate and discipline providers if complaints arise. Additionally, discrepancies between topical only labeling and injectable use can trigger scrutiny.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that. So PDGF on the syringe has a disclaimer that says do not inject for not for injectable use. What do you think about that? How does that relate to the legal standards for this product?
So essentially, when it's labeled not intended for injection, you're effectively acting outside of manufacturer's instructions. So again, you're assuming full liability for any adverse outcome. There's always the potential of violating FDA regulations regarding the use of unapproved biologics. And you definitely are, again, full disclosure, you are increasing malpractice and board investigation exposure because you have to further justify using, public, you have to further justify your actions. So you have to further justify the fact that you've been operating within the standard of care. So there's definitely more responsibility that comes with injecting this product when something is labeled not intended for injection. And it's interesting, I actually learned from Sarah and some other speakers in a recent webinar, the FDA did actually not require this phrasing to be on the product. The manufacturer's packaging team actually felt it would protect the manufacturer from falsely being accused of promoting an unapproved biologic. So this is similar to how exosomes and salmon sperm packaging say for topical use only. So I thought that was actually really interesting. I don't know what your thoughts are about that, Sarah.
Yeah, I think because the FDA really goes much more toward manufacturers, the manufacturers, if the product is approved for a certain use and not for a different use, they, to protect themselves, definitely put very clear labels talking about what it's approved for and not. But I don't think the label itself guides exactly what you're supposed to do because so many treatments are done completely off label. So
Yeah.
it's interesting, but I think you make a very good point. Like the further away you are from using a fully FDA approved product for exactly its use, the harder it'll be for you to justify that it was standard of care and that there wasn't a better approved alternative. And so we know some of the big med spa chains 10 years ago, for example, would only do Botox on label and only the on label units. The industry evolved and now everyone is doing things completely off label and injecting things in lots of different places. And even though some of those big corporate med spas are now doing things off label as well. So I think we are definitely moving much more toward like off label and unapproved uses of things. But the things that have no FDA approval at all for any kind of use anywhere in the body, like for example, like exosomes, are just a much more risky thing to do. Whereas this, since it does have some FDA approvals for other uses, at least it's gone through the rigorous FDA process and has had hundreds, if not thousands, of studies in order for the FDA to approve it in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point.
So any other thoughts about PDGF? Some people ask us, so I know you do a ton of board investigations. We both do, but you're doing one, it seems like one every day. Have you seen any board investigations or board actions related to this product?
I have not seen any board actions related to this product. With respect to board investigations, generally what we see is they care about standards of care and not product approval. If you can show, again, with all the documentation and disclosures that you've educated your patient, you've documented everything, you've practiced responsibly, and you can stand on strong ground, you're in better shape. There are obviously no guarantees in any board investigation, but from what we're seeing with respect to the state boards, we see standard of care, documentation, on onboarding patients. That's some of the key elements that we're seeing providers being investigated on. Believe it or not, most complaints come from competitors and not patients, which makes airtight documentation your best defense. Also, a lot of clients think that a patient consent is sufficient. It's not the only thing that will help a provider in the event of a board investigation. You have to enhance consents with a combination of education, documentation, responsible use, appropriate training, good insurance. It's a combination of factors. Good consent is necessary, but it's not the only element that will protect someone in the event of an investigation.
Yeah, and so many investigations are about good faith exams, right? And like who did the good
Yes.
faith exam and how is your practice structured? Do you have an MSO and MSA? They have nothing to do with really approved or unapproved products. They're more about like supervision, adequate consent, and scope of practice more than anything.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And since you do so many investigations and you're like the investigations expert probably of the world, maybe you could talk just a little bit about some of the recent ones and like what they were about in general, just so people can understand what to watch out for, even more so than these unapproved things, which of course are significant, but the real investigations, like what are they about?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the big ticket items that we're seeing in investigations are who owns the medical practice. In states that restrict the corporate practice of medicine, investigators definitely want to see that physicians or a nurse practitioner with independent practice or full practice owns the practice. Other big ticket items are people at the clinic operating within their scope. And it's very tricky because every state is different. In some states, estheticians can inject Botox. In other states, it's only, RNs and PAs. So it's very important to be specific as the state requirement. The third big ticket item is your patient onboarding process and who is clearing the patient before a procedure is performed. Who's performing that good faith exam? And again, we do see generally NP, PA, or physician performing good faith exam, clearing the patient, and then phase two, writing a patient-specific order, as opposed to just standing orders. So those are the three big things I've been seeing recently. We'll see if anything else arises, but at this point, covering those areas has been a good way and a good defense in the event of an investigation.
Okay, perfect. And any closing words about PDGF?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, there's with opportunity comes responsibility. As Sarah was mentioning, Botox was Botox therapeutic before it became Botox cosmetic. Botox used to be just a muscle relaxant, and now it's used for cosmetic purposes. So things morph over time. And when science is so rapidly changing, that there's a lot of gray. And so there's a bit of risk involved with anything that's new and innovative. Innovation is always risk, but it's always best to approach risk with the best tools. And again, some of the things we've covered today, like documentation, clear disclosure, good insurance, all those things can help mitigate risks in the event of a bad outcome. But science is always moving forward and innovation is is happening in the medical aesthetic space. It's not going to stop, which is really exciting.
Yeah, it's been fun to support people with using new products and innovative products. We just want to help people stay safe and protected. And so we're going to be doing more webinars on other topics as well. And I appreciate sharing your time and sharing your expertise in what is otherwise a very, very busy day. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.